My name's Mario Campa. I've got close to 40 years experience with single malt, not in a professional capacity. Just started exploring with it because a friend of mine liked whiskey and I thought he was out of his mind, and now look at me all these years later. But I started to dabble tasting single malts in college, and one of the first scotches I ever had was Johnny Walker Red, and I thought it was unbelievably nasty. And I thought, if this is what Scotch is, I don't understand what anybody's fascination with this is, and I didn't taste another Scotch for several years. A couple of years later, I was persuaded to try something different. That was a Glenmorangie, which I argue is the greatest gateway whiskey of all time. And I thought, oh, this is really very, very different. And it got me fascinated with the idea of what is single malt whiskey. So I thought we would take a little journey from that capacity through several different regions of Scotland. We also have a single malt today that is produced in India, which is making some very, very beautiful single malt. The whole idea of global single malt has gotten a lot more popular the last decade, and a lot of countries now are making very, very good single malts. And you'll start to see as we get into the industry, I'll tell you a little bit about it. The climate, the water, and the ground, the soil, make a huge impact on how the whiskey comes out. And then, of course, there's this whole elaborate process, as you're aware of, to get from a grain to what's in a bottle. So we'll explore those ideas too. I encourage you to please feel free to ask me questions tonight. This is going to be interactive. I'm not looking to talk at you. I would like to be conversing with you. I run a Bunnahabhain forum with a friend of mine in England. Our forum is actually larger than their own company's own forum. I'm not boasting, but I'm proud of it. And I moderate for Scotch Addict, which is the largest single malt forum on the internet. We've got not quite 50,000 members globally. And I run my own forum as well. I'm known in circles as Sir Drams-a-lot. So if you look at Facebook or Instagram, you can find me under Sir Drams-a-lot. Thank you kindly. So there's a little background as to why you're sitting here listening to me. I'm going to start tonight with this Singleton. I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. Singleton is a company that is owned by Diageo. Does anybody in the room not know what Diageo is or who Diageo is? Okay. Diageo is the single largest spirits company in the world. Their portfolio is tremendous, and they own the most single malt producers, and they also own Johnny Walker, which is the largest selling Scotch whiskey in the world. Astronomical amount of Johnny Walker gets made, and well, we won't go into Johnny Walker tonight, but single malts are produced, which are then blended to go in there. And we were talking earlier about mash bills. In order to be a single malt, you have to use 100% malted barley in the mash bill of what your grain is getting distilled. In the United States, you make bourbon, that is not the case. The mash bill must be at least 51% corn. The other 49% can be a variety of other grains. When you're producing a blended whiskey, you can use what's called other grain whiskeys, but you won't see the word malt, single malt on the label. So if you look at a bottle of Johnny Walker, it'll say Scotch whiskey, won't say single malt. There are also products called blended malts, which means that everything in there is a malted, could be single malt, vatted together, can't be single malt anymore. That's called a blended malt. So anyway, Singleton is a mark that they're not a producer. Singleton doesn't make whiskey. It's a brand name, and they bottle other ones of their distilleries that they don't release a lot of their own expressions. So this is a Glendullan. Glendullan produces predominantly whiskey to go into blends. And under the Singleton name, Diageo bottles this expression as a single malt. So the very first glass is the Glendullan. I chose this to start because it's a very light whiskey. It's, yes. And they're marked on the tasting mat as well, if you look underneath. Okay. Yeah, so that's where you'll start. That's exactly correct. Whiskey is an attack to your palate. Much unlike wine, which is only 13, 14% alcohol, in order to be whiskey, it has to be at least 40% alcohol. It really is an assault on your palate. This particular whiskey is very light. They have huge stills, so they produce a very light, fruity whiskey. And this whiskey is reduced to 40% alcohol. This is the lightest whiskey that we're going to drink this evening. And I wanted to start with this because it's a nice way for your palate to get adjusted to the alcohol onslaught. So this is a nice, light, fruity whiskey. And I think it's gentle on the palate. And I'd actually like, if I do tastings of multiple distilleries, I like to start with this. This is only a $40 bottle. I think it's a really good value. It presents a lot of flavor for 40 bucks. And if you're, whiskey like this is great right now. I think of whiskey as predominantly a winter sport. And if, when you're drinking very heavy whiskeys, they do really well when it's cool out. When it's hot like this, my palate doesn't normally call for something like that. But this is a bottle that you can have on a 100-degree day, and it doesn't weigh you down. What'd you guys think? Yeah, it's nice, isn't it? Yeah, this brand is kind of poo-pooed, but I happen to think that this is a really nice bottling. So it's bottled at 40%. It's reduced, so they vat a bunch of casks together in a huge vat. And before they put it in the bottle, they will add water to reduce it down to 40%. It also keeps the price down, obviously. And this is a Highland distillery. Glendullen is in the Highlands. There's a bunch of food and cheese and fruits and bread in front of you. Certainly feel free. I would say don't eat anything too heavy at start, especially with this. This will pair well with the fruit, maybe the tomato, but when we get out to the Bunnahabhain, if you want to try the sausage, that's where it'll pair well. I'll explain that when we get there. So you can have a completely unpeated whiskey that is matured in a very, very heavily, like you're familiar with 3-char, 4-char, 5-char from having exposure to the bourbon. If you have a 5-char cask and the whiskey's in that cask for a long time, the charcoal not only cleans the whiskey, which is one of the reasons why they do that, there's a couple of reasons why, but it adds a smoke flavor back into the whiskey. So that is one reason. The second is, in Scotland, the water runs, most of the water runs over peat bogs in varying degrees. If you've ever been, anybody here been to Loch Ness? First time I visited Loch Ness was an incredible lesson in this. When you're looking over the back of the boat, the foam is brown. And I thought I was in the South Bronx. It was really weird to look like this water was so clean and the foam was brown. And you look at the water, it's brown. So I actually went to the captain of the boat to ask him. I didn't tell him I'm from, I live near the South Bronx and I don't take the water like this. But he explained to me that Loch Ness is surrounded by hills. And the loch is filled with water that runs down the side of the hills. Those hills are nothing but peat bogs. They pick up so much peat coming down into the loch that the water is actually brown. It's unbelievable. That's an extreme example. Most of the water is not brown. But all of the water will pick up a little bit. So even an unpeated whiskey could have 2 or 3 ppm of peat in it. And then the other thing is just peating the barley, which we will get. Now, you don't add it so much. You smoke it in. We'll get to that when we get to our peated whiskey tonight. The next whiskey we're going to drink is one of the industry mainstays in terms of single malt. Macallan is, I'm going to say, the Rolex of Scotch whiskey. It's a brand that everybody knows. It carries a particular cachet. Many people argue that it's overpriced for what it is because the demand is so very high. I happen to think, I don't necessarily disagree with that. The 18, I think, is a very good whiskey, but not necessarily worth the price. It's exceptionally expensive. But if it fits your palate, I have a bottle at home, let me say. It's definitely nice to have. but it's not something I would want to replace it continually. It's far more expensive than most other 18-year-olds is my point. The 12, I think, is still a great value. It's a bottle that's available for under $100. They have some of the best relationships with the sherry producers in Spain, so they get exceptional casks to mature the whiskey in, and most distillery people will tell you that about 65 or 70% of the flavor that ends up in a whiskey comes from the cask it's matured in. So the fact that these guys have ancient contracts with some of the best sherry producers in Juarez allows them to produce a really flavorful whiskey. So that's why I elected to include this today. It's the second glass. Feel free to help yourselves, get in there when you're ready. If you have any questions about this. The other thing I want you to know about these guys is that is produced in Speyside. Speyside is the largest region of the 5 that are in Scotland, and they are called Speyside distilleries because they are along the River Spey, quite literally on the side of the Spey. That's where the name comes from. And Macallan is one of the prizes there. There are many that you probably are familiar with. Glenfarclas is a Speyside distillery, Glenallachie, Aberlour, Balvenie, which we're going to have a little bit later. A lot of the famous Scotch producers are in Speyside, and they almost exclusively do not peat their whiskey. It's a region that produces a very oily, flavorful, rich whiskey that is predominantly unpeated. Any questions? Any thoughts?
Totally different than the first one.
Yes, that was the goal.
Tasty.
Totally different. So this will be predominantly matured, not exclusively, but predominantly matured in ex-bourbon casks. And the Macallan, this particular Macallan is 100% ex-sherry casks. They do have a 12-year-old that's called the double cask. I happen to think for a couple of extra dollars, this is a lot richer in flavor. Sunil and I actually went back and forth about which one to include. I thought you guys would enjoy this a little bit more, so we elected to do this. But the double cask is a good whiskey, but I think that one doesn't quite stand up to some of the others that you can get at the same price point. This one I think actually shines. The grain that you use, where it is grown, the water source that you're using, the way it's gristed, and the fermentation process is tremendous. The distillation stills vary tremendously. Edward Hour, for example, I don't know if you guys are familiar with a distillery called Edward Hour. They have the second smallest, up until very recently, they were the smallest stills in Scotland. They produce a very heavy, oily malt. Glenmorangie has what they call the draft stills. They are the tallest stills in Scotland, and they produce a very, very light malt. And the effect of maturation from those two producers, from those two types of production, vastly different. A light malt can be ready to drink pretty quickly. A heavy malt needs more time in the wood, for example. So yes, while about 2/3 of the flavor will come from the wood, we still have 1/3 of the flavor that's coming from somewhere else. And we'll explore that a little bit more when we get here. Whiskey number 3. This is one of my favorite sub-$100 bottles. And Michael, thank you for allowing me to include this. I treasure this whiskey. There's never a bad time to reach for Bunnahabhain 12. It is magnificent. I hope you'll find you agree with me. It is a great melding of flavors because it is a vatting of ex-sherry, ex-bourbon, and the ex-sherries are first fill and second fill and third fill. Anybody's curious, I'll answer what that is. I overlooked telling you something important. 2 things. Number 1, I poured these short so that we could revisit any of them that you're curious about afterward. So if there's any of these that you want to try when we're done, there's plenty more left. As you can see the bottles, we can explore these later. The other thing though is, if you look, every other chair has a glass of water with a pipette in it. That is used to call what's either open or bloom the whiskey. The higher alcohol content you get, the more the flavors are clustered in esters. Adding water adds zero flavor. But what it does is it breaks those esters open so that it is easier for your palate to discern what they are. So I encourage you to try these whiskeys just the way they got poured out of the bottle. Assess it just the way the master blender intended for you to taste it. Then put a drop or two of water in it, swirl your glass, and see what it is you think is at the core of that whiskey. You'll find the higher the alcohol is, or the stronger the oiliness is, the more the flavor will open up. So please use those pipettes and just a couple drops. Remember, you can always put more water in. You cannot take the water out. Bunnahabhain is on the island of Islay. It's called the Magical Little Island or the Little Whiskey Island. It's about 35 miles off the west coast of Scotland and about 22 miles north of North Ireland. But this island is actually closer to Ireland than it is to any part of Scotland. And the terrain there, talking about the ground around the globe, is actually North American. So in the last time the continent split up, this island came off of Nova Scotia. All the rock and all the soil is indigenous to North America and not Europe. Very unique in that regard. Bunnahabhain is one of only 2 distilleries on the island that regularly makes unpeated whiskey. Because many of them have done special releases of unpeated whiskey, but they don't regularly produce unpeated whiskey. Islay is known for their peated whiskey, and we will have one later. This, on the other hand, is unpeated. They stopped peating in 1963. They made a decision to differentiate themselves from the rest of the island, and they stopped peating their malt. Predominantly, they still do about 20% of their production as peated whiskey. Bruichladdich is the other one. Bruichladdich releases on a regular basis unpeated whiskey, and they're one of the distilleries in the country that does 3 different types of releases. Bruichladdich is completely unpeated, Port Charlotte, correct, and the most heavily peated is Octomore, that's correct. But in any case, Bunnahabhain does make peated whiskey. They use the old Gaelic term moine. That is Gaelic for peated. So if you're looking at a Bunnahabhain bottle and it says moine on it, be well aware that that is a peated whiskey. But very few of them are released that way. Yes, sir?
The sausage would go well with this one? Is that
Yes,
right?
and the reason I'm saying that is because one of the characteristics that is really indigenous to the island whiskeys and all of the distilleries that exist right along the coastline is a maritime salt flavor. Because they are matured right on the water, and the weather in Scotland can be unfavorable often, they pick up a lot of the salt air. The maturation of whiskey, as you're now well aware, occurs from the exchange of air and temperature inside the casks in the warehouse. Air goes in and out of the casks. That's why we have what's called the angel share. Some evaporates while that's occurring. And the change in temperature, as you know, the doors in your house the last couple days have been very difficult to open because they're sticking. The same thing happens with the casks. As it becomes warm and humid, the the grain of the wood opens up and the whiskey goes into the wood. And when it gets cold and dry, they close and it pushes the whiskey back out of the wood. So while a whiskey or even wine, when you're maturing wine in wood, is constantly going in and out of the wood, and that is one of the big reasons why wood impacts the maturation of whiskey so very much. And there is lore about storms so ferocious that the water is actually splashing onto the warehouses occasionally. Not that that happens often or that I've ever seen it. But yeah, this is one of the unpeated whiskeys that's made on Islay. This is just about my favorite region, and as I told you, I run a forum for this distillery. I happen to think that this is a great 12-year-old and a phenomenal value, and that's why I said that I thought the sausage would mate well with this, because there's a oiliness and a salinity to this that would mate well with the sausage, in my opinion, and that's nothing more than that. What you think mates well with your whiskey is completely your own thing. This is designed, as every single regular release is, they're designed to be as close to identical from batch to batch to batch. Now, it's not possible to really achieve that 100% of the time, because the casks that they're drawing from vary as the maturation varies and so many things vary, but they do a pretty reasonable job. And I have held the Diageo master blenders in very high regard for years and years and years. It's unbelievable the variety of things that go into Johnnie Walker, that they are actually consistent from batch to batch, is unbelievable to me. This is a little bit easier because they're using one distillery and the stock from the one distillery. But the batches will vary a teeny bit. On the other hand, the 12s are quite specifically meant to be different from one to another. Another great example of that is Redbreast. They do a regular 12-year-old and they do a 12 cask strength, which you guys are very well aware with. Every year, it's designed to be different year to year, to excite your palate in a different way. And that's another whiskey I hold in very high regard. If you happen to like the idea of cask strength, the RB12 cask strength is one of the best values on any shelf. They're similar in that they're both all barley, but single malt has to be 100% malted barley, whereas Irish whiskey is typically somewhere about 50% malted barley and 50% green unmalted barley, which is one of the things that gives Irish whiskey its characteristic. And the distillation, this is 2 times distilled, Irish whiskey is 3 times distilled. And yes, there are a couple of scotches that are also 3 times distilled. This one, the smoke flavor would be exclusively from the cask and the water source. Like, this is measurable from their water source at, like, I think it's 2 or 3 ppm. It's minor, but it's not non-existent. Okay, our 4th whiskey is from a distillery called Indri. This distillery is in India, and I think that they are one of the real champion single malt producers outside of Scotland. And it's a category that's getting a lot of legs here in the United States. Next time Mike asks me to do this for him, God, please, we'll visit with an American single malt. Just very recently, the American single malts are actually getting the attention they deserve. They're doing very good work. This Indri encompasses 2 things besides value that I think are exceptional. And again, I will say one of the 3 things is I think this whiskey's another steal. This is a triple cask. The Trini relates exactly to the fact that it is matured in 3 different types of wood. I historically have gravitated to that because of the complexity of flavor that imparts. We're talking about how important wood maturation is to the flavor of the whiskey. The industry typically will use ex-bourbon casks, Oloroso casks, port casks, Madeira casks, sherry casks, and the industry also uses wine casks. So the variety of styles of casks are used to mature the whiskey, and each of those casks, because of what it held prior, imparts a different flavor into the whiskey. A triple wood and Bushmill 16 and 21 are great examples of triple woods you might already be familiar with. Those are vattings of 3 different types of casks, and I just think that produces a beautiful bouquet of flavor. The vatting here, I know this has ex-bourbon and sherry. The third is, I'm going to apologize, I don't remember. I should have looked this up before I started.
French red wine.
Thank you kindly. The third one is French red wine. Thank you. So each of these casks imparts a different flavor into the whiskey, and when they vat them together in their own formula, not often a third, and a third, produces the flavor that the master blender is seeking. So that's one of the things about this that I hold in high regard.
So do they change the casks throughout the maturation process, or do they just blend them after?
Okay, that can be done either way. So there are instances where a whiskey will be often in an ex-bourbon cask, and then the whiskey will get poured into a different cask, and that's called a finish. Typically, a finish is under 18 months. So that does get done. In this instance, they're maturing whiskey in 3 different types of casks, and then they are vatted together before they're bottled. So it does happen both ways. It's almost universal around the globe that single malt is matured for 3 years. You guys notice how extremely oily, how very viscous this is? It coats the palate in a big way. And I was curious about that because that normally comes in, the process of distillation causes oil, the process of fermentation causes oil, and then some oil can also be extracted from the wood. But this was really oily and it made me curious. So I asked one of the presentation I was at with one of the guys from the distillery. They use 6-row barley, which is unheard of today. So most barley is 2 rows. And the reason 2-row barley is used is because it produces a lot of barley per acre. 6-row barley produces less output per acre. So it's more expensive to grow and make whiskey from. But it produces a very flavorful and very viscous whiskey. Now, most of the industry had used 6-row barley, if you're going back, say, 80 years or more. And over time, as the economies of production came in, they moved away to 2-row barley, and it's almost exclusive now around the world. Indri decided to make their whiskey with 6-row barley and absorb the expense of that, try to be competitive still in what has become a very competitive marketplace. And I applaud them. I think they're doing a great job. Now, in terms of the weather, the effect of that around the globe is tremendous. And I'll use a contrast between bourbon and Scotch as one example of this. In Scotland, where the temperature is low and the humidity is high, and the temperature tends to be fairly consistent, casks lose alcohol faster than they lose water. So what is the Angel's share in Scotland and other regions like Scotland, England and Ireland? The ABV reduces while the whiskey's in the cask. So it normally goes in at 63.5. Not everybody does that, but most do. And as it sits in the cask, alcohol's evaporating, and you'll find that as you're looking at an older whiskey, it is not uncommon for the alcohol level to be lower if it's not reduced because alcohol is evaporating. In Kentucky, in Tennessee, we get the polar opposite. The temperature tends to be very, very high, and the casks evaporate more water than they do alcohol. So as the whiskey's maturing, the alcohol level is increasing. And the interaction between the whiskey and the wood is very different when the alcohol goes up as opposed to when the alcohol comes down. So one of the things you'll find, 2 of the things you find here is, number 1, the alcohol level is increasing. Taiwan is like that as well. The real problem is, in climates like that, is they lose a lot of whiskey. You can age a whiskey in Scotland or Ireland for 25 or 30 years and still have something to bottle. You get into a climate like this, you have an empty barrel. So they're typically bottling younger because they are evaporating so much of the content of the cask. But because of the temperature swings, you also get a little bit more exchange. And I would say, my own experience is that doesn't replace maturation time, it's just different. So this is an opportunity for you to taste something that is basically extinct. That they're the only distillery that I know of that is using exclusively 6-row barley. So that was one of the things about this. The triple wood is also exciting to me. I like the complexity of flavor that produces. And in keeping with the theme that I've shared with you from the beginning, I think this bottle's a steal. This is a great whiskey for $60. And I will tell you that there is single malt made in South America, but I haven't tasted anything that's worth talking about.
Fair enough.
But there are other parts of the globe where that's not the case. Sweden makes very good single malt. And Japan, you probably guys know, and Taiwan and India, South Africa, Australia makes very good single malt. As I had said earlier, we are starting to make some very good single malt here in the United States. But and there's actually 1 or 2 producers in Canada that are not too bad. Had some decent Canadian single malts. I did a tasting for our club in January last year where we explored global single malts. And I wanted to include one from every continent. And the South American ones were just, I abandoned the idea before I poured a whiskey that I didn't think was worth tasting, you know what I mean? Balcones is very good, not even my favorite. Virginia's doing great work. Westland is doing great work. Town Branch makes a really good single malt. Old Line. Stranahan's makes a great single malt. One in Park City makes a decent single malt. Yeah, this landscape today, drastically different than 10 years ago. There's a lot of good single malts made here in the United States now. You know, the warehouse is doing that all by itself.
Right, I guess so.
Yeah, the heat in a Texas warehouse, you can imagine with the warehouse. Well, you know where that becomes a big deal is where the cask is. You have a cask on the bottom rack or a cask at the top of a rick house, they're behaving very, very, very differently. And some distilleries allow that to happen naturally and then use the disparities to make their blends. And some distilleries will take particular sections of the warehouse and they rotate the casks so that the maturation is a little more well-rounded over the course of time. And that's a distillery for the master blender and decisions for the master blender, the master distiller, and the warehouse manager. But both occur. Now you'll find one of the things I love about this, it's a bottomless pit. The number of options for producing whiskey and just the level of creativity you can reach is unbounded. It's you know, the more you find, you start digging in, the more you realize how little you know. There's more to dig to. Everybody ready? Gentlemen, I move you on to our star of the show. This Balvenie 21 is matured in former port casks. I've been a Balvenie fan for many years. I actually was fortunate, honored enough to be invited to their introduction party to the United States. I've carried that with me for many years. I think they make a great whiskey. They're one of the few distilleries in Scotland that is a complete producer. And by that I mean they have a cooperage on site. So that if you go and take a tour of Balvenie, not only do you get to see the production of the whiskey and the warehouses where it's matured, you can actually look at how the casks are maintained right on site. I think there are only 3, them, Loch Lomond, and I believe one other has a cooperage on site. It's very rare. Talking about 2 or 3 amongst 140 distilleries. A cooperage is an amazing thing to see. The process of how a cask gets torched is really very cool. I recommend it to anybody who's got a passion for this.
Cooperage?
Yes, a cooperage is the name for a facility that maintains a cask. And a couple of distilleries have a cooperage right on grounds. Balvenie is one and Loch Lomond is another. And it makes those visits a little bit more exciting because you get to see a lot more of the process. And I'm telling you, watching a cask get shaved and torched is really very cool. So this distillery is reputed as having one of the most engaging tours in all of Scotland. If you want to visit Balvenie you can visit Balvenie, but if you want to go and take a tour, you've got about 3 months lag time. You got to book your tour at least a quarter out if you want to get a tour here. I mean, it's extremely, extremely high demand, and the place is gorgeous. It's very well situated, and I think they make a great whiskey. Their core range is very varied. They were one of the distilleries that introduced multi-casking to me. Their double cask was available here in the States back in the 90s. I think it's still a wonderful whiskey to this day. They are kind of become a junior Macallan. This is a distillery that also commands a premium for their releases based upon their age and et cetera, et cetera. Not at all unwarranted, just like I said about Macallan. But I happen to think that this one is a standout. I was especially pleased that you allowed me to do this. I wanted to pour one thing today that I thought was really...
I got strong arms, but they send me the bill. You didn't ask.
I've not seen it, I have no clue. So,
So,
yeah.
if you don't mind, how would you describe this one? For me, like, and I'm a novice here, but that's the most balanced, I feel like.
yeah, I'd say balanced is probably a great word to describe most all of the Balvenis, and it's one of the characteristics about them where I feel like they've earned their reputation. They make a really nice, well-rounded, approachable, but complex, deep. This one, I think, has a great depth of flavor. It's one of the reasons why I really wanted to pour this. I overwhelmingly like port maturation. There are some instances I've experienced with, well, basically with any type of maturation where it didn't work as well as it was intended. But I happen to think that port does a good job, as most fortified wines will do. And I think this is one of the exquisite examples of how good port maturation can impact a Scotch whiskey. And I think your description is excellent. It really is a very well balanced and complex flavor.
But in addition to that description, I mean, I would add, so this got a little bit of smoky, peaty qualities.
And that is exclusively casking and water, because this expression is completely unpeated.
So it's just this, okay, so it's just,
Yep. They make a peated whiskey that they release as an annual release.
so is it is it the smokiness of the cask, or?
And the water, that latent flavor that you get from the water, and you may taste it a little bit more in here.
When you get
But-
to the yard bag, you're going to know peanut.
Right.
Don't ruin this for me.
Mark, geographically, where is Balvenie? Is it on the island of Islay, or is it space?
Okay.
Where
So this is an Isla whiskey. Isla is kind of a screwed up horseshoe, so to speak, and they exist on the northeast section on what is called the Sound of Isla. They don't face the ocean. They're on the east side of the island. They exist in between, well, on the shore that faces Jura. And the Sound of Isla is in between Jura and Isla, and that's where they are situated. Balvenie is another Speyside. When you're looking at a Scotch whiskey, the number that exists on the label must be the youngest whiskey that went into the vatting. The youngest. So when you're looking at, for example, Ardbeg is a great example of that. That's not so much true today because a lot of their old stock has dried up. But one of the things that is true, like if you get your hands on a 20-year-old bottle of Ardbeg 10, which you can find at an auction house, there's a lot of 18-year-old whiskey in there. A lot.
Okay.
And you know what? That gets me to let me answer that a little bit more elaborately. This is a no age statement whiskey, right? There's no age statement. These are referred to as NAS. Now you see there's no number on here. Now this is not a good example of what I want to say because Indri is a fairly young producer and they don't have old whiskey. But there was a time, you know what? I'm screwing up. Our next whiskey is a perfect example. Let me go off on this when we get to the Ardbeg because this is a perfect example of what I want to talk about. You ever hear of an oyster luge? Is that a term that, okay. If you take an Isla whiskey and pour a tiny bit onto your oyster, that's a mouth orgasm. That is so good. Yeah, and definitely do that. And I will tell you that some of my favorites, the less viscous whiskeys I prefer, but that is completely personal. But I will typically use like Kalila 12 or Ardbeg 10.
No horse red, nothing, you just, that's it.
Yep, just a few drops. It's fabulous. I'm not exaggerating. Oyster Luge is great. And so the point I'm making with that is when you're drinking a whiskey that has a salty flavor, pairing that, that's why I suggested you mate the Bunnahabhain with the sausage. The saltiness complements one another. It is common thought that when you're drinking a very sherried whiskey, that pairs really well with chocolate. And I absolutely believe in that. Any kind of either milk or dark chocolate, whatever your preference is with a sherried whiskey, beautiful, beautiful pairing. Something like the Singleton, I like this with a slice of pear, I think would be gorgeous. Maybe pear and brie, something like that. So it's no steadfast rule. Those are kind of guidelines. But you know, for me, I taste a whiskey, and if it brings to my mouth the idea of some food, man, it's gonna work.
From our plate, what would you drink?
Well, I would probably do the sausage with either the Bunnahabhain or the Ardbeg. The cheese, I think you could have done with almost any of them. The fruit, certainly the Singleton, probably the Indri Balvenie or the Bunnahabhain would have gone really nicely with the fruit. Tomato's an open thing. If you like the tomato, that would have made it with, and none of them is a wrong answer. That's what I would do, but that's what suits my palate. The idea is do pairings that suit your palate. One of the tastings I do annually is for a professionals club called the Union Club. There are several of them around the country. I go out to Cleveland every year to do a whiskey pairing dinner that they've been doing for, I don't know, 20 or 30 years. And I will talk to the head chef, tell him the whiskey that I'm going to be pouring that night. And then I will describe the whiskeys to him, and then he'll put together the pairings for the club. I give him the characteristics of the whiskey. I've had input on a couple of dishes, but I mean, this is going to be my 5th year doing this with them. Predominantly, that's his job. So I tell him what the whiskey's going to taste like, and he'll prepare dishes that mate well with those flavors. And it's been successful enough that I'm going back for the 5th time. Okay, so I have a bunch of things to talk about with this guy. I want you all to feel fortunate because this is last year's. This is an annual release. Isla has a festival that was celebrated its 40th anniversary. It's known as the Fay Shield. That's Greek for, that's Gaelic, not Greek at all. It's Greek, I did it again. Thank you, it's Latin. It's Gaelic for Isla Festival. So each of the distilleries will release a whiskey in honor of the festival, and that has kind of grown out around Scotland. There's now a Speyside Festival, and Campbelltown also does a festival, and they were smart enough to do it the week before Isla, and now a lot of us foolish enough to go to both. But the distilleries will release something special in honor of the festival, and then they often will theme their day at the distillery around the release that they've produced. So Spectacular was Ardbeg's 2024 festival release. This has been long sold out, and when I was here putting together this list, I saw that Sunil had acquired a couple cases of this. That can happen in this industry because of what is known as the 3-tier system. I won't bore you with that, but what that means is one company has to import whiskey, a second company has to get it to the retailer, and then the retailer has to get it to the end user. And that chain, it is illegal to break that chain. Another kind of one of these lobbying things. It is not horribly uncommon that a couple cases end up buried behind new stuff that a distributor has gotten in, and when they clear the new cases out, lo and behold, oh my God, we've got a couple of cases of this left over, where can it go? I think because of the size of the store, Sunil gets that call regularly, and that is the reason why we have this whiskey today. This, like I said, this is last year's, and I believe He had this year's, but I was really excited to present something to you that was not available. And I happen to really like the Spectacular. I thought it was a great vatting. So I wanted you to know about the exclusivity of this bottle. I also want you to know that this is the one truly heavily peated whiskey that we're having this evening. Ardbeg peats to a fairly high level compared to most of the industry. Peating is measured in parts per million. You heard me say the water, 2-3 ppm. That's parts per million. Common is 35 to 40 ppm. That's common. Ardbeg peats to 50 ppm. Now there's no real standard. We were talking about the Octomore is always in excess of 100. Ardbeg peats their supernovas and hypernovas to 100. That's a special release. Their regular peat level is 50 ppm. So you're going to notice that this is drastically different than the other 5 that we've had. And that smoky flavor, and one of the things maybe you can think about amongst the whiskeys that we've had prior is to see the difference between the smoky flavor that gets imparted by the char from a cask as opposed to the smoky flavor that gets imparted from the peat. The peat smoke tends to be a little bit more earthy in flavor, whereas the char from a cask, it's just that charcoal is a purifier. Adds a smoke, but not so much an earthiness. So this one is a fairly heavily peated whiskey. And the other thing I wanted to discuss with this was what you had mentioned earlier. This is an NAS whiskey. No age statement. There's no number on this bottle. When they became popular, maybe a decade or so ago, there was talk that distilleries were looking for a way to increase their profitability by releasing whiskeys that didn't have an age statement. But in getting to speak with a lot of master blenders, I've learned that that's really not the case at all. There's certainly instances where using younger casks makes their blending, their vatting less expensive. Yes, that's true. But the goal in an NAS whiskey is to produce a flavor profile that an age statement precludes. Now, when you have a whiskey like this, you are limited to using the casks that you have that are at least 12 years old. That's what the law dictates. When you have an NAS, the only thing you're governed by is that it has to be whiskey. So anything at least 3 years old is legal to put in here. Now, typically 3-year-old whiskey is not used. It's usually 5 to 6 is about where a vatting will start. A whiskey will be considered for vatting so that it can get a little bit more maturity cleaned up by the cask. But NAS whiskeys, likely to have a 6, a 12, and 18 in the vatting. And the reason for that is that those casks provide a very different flavor profile to the vatting. A young whiskey is extremely vibrant, has a little bit of heat. I mean, think about, a puppy versus a dog, or even your children, at age 8 compared to 23. I mean, as anything matures, it changes. When a whiskey spends time in wood, it's extracting a lot of the tannins from the wood, and the wood is extracting a lot of the harshness and the buckness from the whiskey. So you get more wood notes from an older whiskey, and you get more kind of spry notes from the younger whiskey. And by putting them together, it allows the master blender to come up with a very broad flavor. So that's what NAS whiskeys are all about. And I probably would have included this even if it had an age statement, because I was excited to pour you something that was a year old. Peating happens when the barley is dried. So it's literally they use peat to produce a fire, just like we would with wood at home. They use peat in Scotland. That was indigenous for centuries. And the smoke goes up through the barley, and the smoke imparts a flavor. Like, certainly you're familiar with this with smoking meats, right? Same exact thing. They measure the amount of phenols that get imparted into the barley, and then they will stop at a particular measurement. That's where the peat level is measured. taking it out of there and then just mashing it reduces the peat, and distilling it, the fermentation, and putting it in wood, especially very heavily charred wood, reduces the peat level. So because it was 50 ppm when it was produced, does not mean it's anywhere near 50 ppm when you're drinking it. And the longer it sits in a cask, the lower that number becomes.
You would think the char would add to it, no?
The char reduces, like charcoal, you know, like,
Right, cleans it.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Your water filter. If you have a water pitcher in your fridge, those are charcoal filters. They're charcoal like copper. The reason why copper stills are used removes impurities. So the charcoal adds a smoky flavor, but is removing impurities from the whiskey. So it's actually making it a little softer tasting. Every expression is going to be a little different, and the flavor that gets imparted is different. It also can vary by distillery. You know, it's a great example of this. Unfortunately, I can't easily do this in the United States because it's not readily available. The best example I could give you is Talisker Storm. They make an expression called Storm that is part of their regular release, and most any store that carries Talisker either carries Storm or can order it for you. They also release something called Dark Storm. Now that's a travel retail only. You can only get Dark Storm when you're going to a duty-free shop. It's not brought in, it's not exported otherwise yet, hopefully. The only difference between they take Storm and put it in 5 char casks and then bottle it. And I promise you, you would be shocked at the difference between the two. And I will tell you that Storm is my least favorite Talisker, which is one of my favorite distilleries. They make great whiskey in my opinion. Storm has been my least favorite Talisker of all time. Dark Storm, I think, is absolutely brilliant. The difference between the two is shocking and a great way to get a study in the difference casking imparts and what heavy char will do.